know who Jason Silva is, but he was basically talking about some scientists that said that epigenetics is actually much, more profound in evolution than we thought, and it's like a way for that the cell is like a way for turning experience into biology, which sounds very Lamarckian. So,
my understanding of epigenetics, which could be wrong, but from the little bit I've read, is the idea is that there are genetic element, or there are genes that developed during the evolutionary past that had, and the reason they developed is because they had, they were evolutionary productive, which means they enhanced the reproductive and survival fitness of the organism at some point in the past. But then as those genes were no longer useful in later environments, they got, I don't know what this means, chemically, but they got switched off. But they're still there. They're just not, they're not expressed they're not phylogen, or what's the word?
Phylogenetic?
Phenotypically. They're not, they don't appear in the actual organism because they're switched off. But then what can happen is when you have those stresses from, that past recur, then those genes can get turned back on. And so, the classic example was during the Holocaust, there were people in the prisoner of war camps whose bodies developed strategies for surviving that were pretty extreme, and then some of those biological features reappeared in their children, and so it looked as if their personal experience had somehow affected their germ cells, as Bergson calls them. But actually what happened was that those extreme situations turned on those genes, which then had an effect on their body, and then those genes were turned on in their germ cells. And so those epigenetic effects reappeared in their children. But it wasn't like there was no immediate genetic change from one generation to the next, nor was there, to put it in Bergson's term, an influence of somatic cells, body cells on the germ cells. None of that happened. It was just there was genetic material that had already been there but was not expressed. And then it became expressed, and then that expression was passed into the next generation. So that's my understanding of epigenetics. And it gives you this sort of pseudo-Lamarckian effect, because you do have these experiences of the parents that have an effect on the children, but it's not because there was an immediate change in the parents. It was because an ancient, change was sort of reinvigorated in the present. That's why I say it's pseudo-Lamarckian.
Seems interesting that it's kind of like, so it was all already pre-given genetically, but then there's this difference in how it's expressed that changes, that has a kind of partial Lamarckian effect.
Right.
Interesting. Because then that kind of leads to the question, well, how did the genesis of those genetics occur? And also that as an actual kind of mechanism of living or survival or whatnot. It's interesting that it has this capacity to kind of like express itself in all these different ways in accordance with experience.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of the shocker for people who discovered it, is that there were these, I'm not an expert in this, so I may say something that's wrong, but people have known for a long time, since the middle 20th century, but people have known for a while that there are genes in the genome that are not expressed, that are sort of dead genetic material. But I don't think people realized that there was inactive genetic material that could be reactivated by environmental conditions. But I think what the, you know, what the conventional geneticists would say is that the way those genetic mechanisms evolved was because the species was in a sustained environmental stress for a long period of time. So for example, in the case of the Holocaust thing, you know, it's not hard to imagine that sometime in the prehistory of the evolution of the human species, that whatever, I don't know, humans or proto-humans for a long period of time were in a condition of sustained near starvation. And the idea is that because of those conditions, they developed these mechanisms for coping with that, which then became genetically encoded. And then, and here's where I don't know if they even know why this happens, but then when those conditions no longer pertain for some period of time, those biological mechanisms are no longer helpful and might even be harmful to the procreation and survival of the species. So they get switched off, but they don't, you know, the impression I get is, and I'm speculating here at this point, that, you know, it sounds like once you get something in your genome, it's kind of stuck there, and it just either is never expressed, as in the case of some of these so-called dead genes, or in the case of epigenetics, they sort of go dormant, but then can be reinvigorated.
I think that would be the term, Nevitt, dormancy.
Dormant.
Yeah, I think that would be the best way of thinking about it. Did anybody ever hear of Lysenko?
Not me.
Lysenko was the dominant biologist in the Soviet Union from the early 1930s until Khrushchev's overthrow. And so he even survived Stalin's death. And he basically made the argument that changes in a biological organism from the environment could be passed on to the children. And that fit in with Stalinist ideology of, you know, creating the new socialist man. And so he was extraordinarily powerful, but at the same time, his influence had very serious negative effects on Soviet agriculture. But what Nevitt was saying, do you remember reading Nevitt anywhere, or Chase or anybody else? I could have sworn that lately people have been looking at characteristics of a pregnant woman, biological characteristics of a pregnant woman, and then similar characteristics in then the person who was born from the pregnant woman. And there's been that people have been a little shocked, because it does look like what the woman is experiencing during the 9 months of pregnancy actually gets passed on to the child. And that made a lot of people uncomfortable because of the, wait a second, I thought we were following Mendel's genetics, and this seems to be, you know, going back to Lamarck. Has anybody read anything about that?
I've read about something about that, and also that, so a woman, basically her, I'll just speak as in biological terms, basically her sexual partners, basically when genetic material from sperm like gets into her, it actually gets absorbed somewhat into her body and can actually be passed down into her eventual baby, even if that isn't the father. So that there is a kind of looseness or a plasticity, I guess, in terms of what genes go where. And really, I think it's really that kind of as individuals, we're a little more fluid, I think, than people realize, or at least the kind of maybe like a classical biology would say. And I think that's kind of what Bergson is sort of getting at. Was to me, I envision a lot of this kind of like images or metaphors, whatnot, of a kind of liquid or water there's also kind of like a force, and he's kind of trying to express that to show that how exactly these concretions kind of develop, which, but I don't really know enough about biology or science to really kind of determine the validity of those ideas on that level, which I wish I did, but I don't.
Well, if I could throw a curveball, what people who breed dogs and they are very concerned about purebreds. If a female purebred dog is violated by a male who is not a purebred of that species, of that not species, what's the word, breed, then that female is no longer considered eligible. And when you said about what you just said, Chase, it instantly reminded me of that principle in dog breeding, that even if the dog doesn't get impregnated by that not a purebred dog, that the female now cannot be used for breeding purposes.
So
And
I wonder how much of
why that role ever existed.
So I wonder how much of that is really kind of based off of their observation of like practical results, and what is kind of based off of maybe say kind of like categorical intellectual ideas that possibly have like a kind of resonance with the kind of like I'm imagining like almost like a Nazi based like idea of like race science and things like that.
Yeah,
yeah, because I remember there's like PETA protesters at a dog show. Basically, they dressed up as Nazis to show that basically dog breeders had like the Nazi like ideas or something like that. But I don't know, possibly a connection there. Dog Nazis.
That article I posted was just one I just found. I had not heard of this, but when Ed mentioned that, I did a Google search, and this is an MIT technology review article from 2009. But it looks like it's what you guys are talking about. So anyway, I just posted that there. I've been kind of skimming through it, and what I've not been able to tell is whether they think these changes that were passed from the mother to the children were epigenetic or whether they were something else. But what seems to have particularly surprised the researchers is that these changes happened to the mothers prior to them being pregnant. And so we're comparing cats here. Yeah. So, but so apparently, it's, if you have like fetal alcohol syndrome where a woman drinks too much alcohol during pregnancy, and that can cause birth defects, but apparently these effects were things that happened to the mother prior to pregnancy, but then also had an effect on the children. But I don't know if they mention epigenetics in here, but I don't know if they're saying that's what caused it or something else. But they do say it's raising questions about Lamarck again.
One, I think thing that we're going to have to kind of like wait to answer is, I mean, because I think Bergson sets it up in such a way that when we're like comparing different biological theories, for instance, whether we should take them as like refutations of what Bergson is saying, or because towards the end of this chapter, he notes that all of these are true in a particular sense, and specifically defines science as because it's so oriented towards not determining essences, but providing means for like function for like human practice. Each of these senses is applicable in its proper sphere. So, I think, so we've gotten that so far. And then at the end, he kind of like intimates that he's going to like lead into what philosophy is, which is sort of I don't know, you call it like a parallax view. So, you have two complementary linguistic frameworks for defining a physical or biological event. Both are necessary in their own particular perspective, and somehow philosophy is going to get a view of this like whole that can encapsulate both. So I think part of the difficulty right now is like, we can turn to X biological theory or Y biological theory, and it might refute or confirm some aspects of Bergson's scientific observations or, interpretations of scientific theories. But, as to the question, I mean, what Bergson is doing is like philosophy, not science. So ultimately, I think we're going to have to kind of like wait and see what methodology and, conceptual system Bergson offers us to see if we might be able to like articulate the, harmony or complementarity of different, approaches to contemporary biology.
My son wanted to make a comment, so I'm going to step off for a second.
Just a small note on the Science of Epigenetics. There's apparently only a few percent of human DNA that is actively used for, or actively expressed for proteins and building our body and all of that. And an older theory was that there was a whole bunch of leftover junk from viruses. More recently, some researchers have been suggesting that a lot of that, the extra 95 or 98% of our DNA that's not expressed is unused epigenetic sequences. So that over the course of our evolution, there's a lot of different things, and instead of us losing various attribute, instead of us losing the genetic material, it's simply not expressed, and that other 95% of our DNA that is not actively used is potentially epigenetic material.
Okay. Thanks.
He doesn't want to join the conversation, but he wanted to make that comment.
So if there's actually, that huge percentage of the genome or whatnot that is, the junk DNA. So if that's epigenetic sequences, wouldn't that kind of mean that that is a kind of Lamarckian thing in the sense that it's changing the genome, I guess, in the sense that it's kind of putting those sequences then inside there. So yeah, I guess that goes back to what we started off with, like, is that a Lamarckian thing in the sense that experience is then being put into the genes as their particular sequence. So
maybe
I don't know.
Maybe at this point it's just picky semantics then, because I think what Lamarck was proposing was that your behavior, like my behavior in this life, would modify the sex cells, but then in their time they didn't even know about genetics, and so I guess one way you could think about this is that maybe there is a Lamarckian effect, and maybe we've just now begin to find the genetic mechanisms for it. So you could you could sort of say, well, Lamarck wasn't exactly on the mark, but maybe he was on the mark, and we've just to a significant degree, and we've just now found how that works out, perhaps. So yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, so to kind of go back to what Brad was talking about, about exactly what this role is for these different evolutionary theories and for the work of, positive science, as he calls it. I think it's kind of interesting, and also goes along with how we might evaluate Bergson's ideas, in the sense that I think naturally a lot of people that are just kind of, trained in the sciences sort of habitually will evaluate things by those, by basically the standards that they use, in terms of they need something that is definite, that has practical application, usually for industry or technology or something along those lines. And so I think, so Bergson, he says in here, basically what he's doing for philosophy, he's trying to basically converge some of the aspects of all these different theories together into something that's more comprehensive. But he says, so in my version of the book, it's at the top of page 85. Result of the discussion, I guess, is the subheading. But anyways, he says basically that it'll converge in order to obtain a more comprehensive, although thereby of necessity a less definite idea of the evolutionary process. So I think that's interesting that he kind of recognizes that this is going to be a less definite idea. And you see that he talks about this in terms of his philosophy in general, that, we're not going to be able to give some kind of definite mechanical account, because that's exactly what he's kind of arguing against, is that there is a kind of, there are partial determinations, there's partial indeterminations of these things. And I wonder if the danger here of saying, Bergson, he's outdated, and all these ideas are, what do these ideas mean anymore? This is just poetry, is that we will try to basically evaluate him in terms of these standards of practical application in science, instead of as a kind of philosophical theory. So we almost have to kind of, somewhat like have a suspension of disbelief of basically the way that culture has kind of ingrained in us to think in terms of practical application for industry and whatnot, which, I mean, I think that's probably something that extends, basically beyond our particular culture. And I think Bergson would probably agree with that. There's something kind of inherent about practical application that I think he would see that as part of the intellect. And I think that's interesting that he kind of still ties us back, even at the very end, basically to a kind of this dichotomy or this interplay between the intellect and the kind of intuitive, durational aspect of life and whatnot. So, yeah.
But he does, at least in this chapter, he does, I think, he's explicitly saying that neither mechanism nor finalism can actually explain what happens in evolution. And so at least that part of his, at least that claim may be under threat. Now, whether there's other claims like what's the role of philosophy versus what's the role of science might still be viable, but if they're, one of the conclusions I came to when struggling with issues of, faith and that sort of thing was, well, you could probably explain the origin of the world without having to appeal to a God or a divine creator, but that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a divine creator. Well, that may be true, but if you can explain it without that, why would you want to insert that? And so as far as an explanation of how evolution works, if at least that part of it, if contemporary science thinks it can explain those things that he thinks cannot be explained, then that at least challenges that part. It may not challenge the whole of his project, but it might challenge that part of it.
I mean, I agree that would be a challenge, but I think that I would say the entire thing hinges on whether or not we can accept like this particular point. Because what Bergson is saying is that mechanism and finalism are insufficient because they don't take into account real time, which is duration. So if we think that, I mean, we can say that science could give an account that works of how these mechanisms function, but if we ultimately want to determine like the essence of the thing, like the philosoph, which is, I think Bergson would say, is a philosophical practice of like the entirety of the whole, then we can't take out this temporal aspect. So I think, you know, if Bergson can, I mean, he's going to have to explain and give us a reason to believe that there is this intuitive access, you know, like epistemological access used really loosely to a time. I mean, because as I read this, I think of like McTaggart. I don't know if anybody's ever read his Refutation of Time as like time is non-existent, because it's either, every definition that we could give of time is either circular, contradictory, or insufficient. And he has like a whole bunch of reasons why this would be the case, you know. And so for McTaggart, time is just a sort of like ideological, subjective illusion that we put upon determinations of order, that we necessarily do this because our perspective is limited. But, you know, if we thought of things as they really are, then we would see that time is not a part of like, you know, like real ontological, like the set of things that really exist. I mean, you could say, if you wanted to go the route where it's like, you know, oh, well, you know, contemporary biology and physics, or, you know, genetics or whatever, refutes Bergson, but he can still have his philosophy on the side. I think like the wrench that would get thrown in that is that, you know, what Bergson's philosophy is fundamentally saying is that time is a real element. Like, it's not just a subjective illusion that's put on things. So if we want to determine like evolutionary progress or like a process, and are like taking out of it, you know, real time in the way that Bergson defines it, then I think we'd have to like throw away the entire philosophy as such. I'm not sure we need to do that. Like, I think that that's why I think that he can kind of have his cake in, like, the reason that I brought up the distinction between like science and philosophy is I think he can kind of have his cake and eat it too. Like, we can define mechanism scientifically, but if we're talking about essences, if we're talking about like doing philosophy, we would have to be like, it'd be like a supplement, like something in addition to that definition, or series of complementary definitions, like Lamarckian, Darwinian, whatever, you know, things that we decide actually inhere in evolutionary processes.
Yeah, so I think that stressing of the importance of time is really important, because I see his idea of the whole, you know, the original impetus of these things that he talks about as basically, that's just another way of talking about time. So he's basically saying that time as a kind of real ontological force, just acting in particular here in the realm of biology and life and organized matter, that's basically what this idea, the you know, this drive, this original impetus and tendency to change is. So we really have to understand on that level. And I see what he's saying here in terms of, well, basically, it really goes back to exactly what he was saying. He's really reiterating his critique of the intellect here, in terms of basically showing that this kind of, you know, atemporal reduction of things to these partial elements that then repeat themselves, that's not actually how time works. That time has this capacity to first of all, it's an undivided, indivisible whole that works through this kind of process, though, of differentiation that brings new forms into being. And I see that as exactly what he's saying, but he's just saying it in terms of biology now. So I think that's really interesting. And that's also, I think, why he would say basically that, we have, no matter kind of how far advanced, say, like a mechanism gets in terms of kind of explaining the complexity of these things, I think he would still want to have some kind of answer as to like, okay, well, basically, yeah, you still have this kind of, further and further, detail of, the units, like he talks about like, the mosaic of the artist, and how, the artistic act is this indivisible, simple whole, this act, this creative act of this kind of fluid creation. And then when the intellect tries to understand that, it does it by breaking it up into these bits. And further these details get the smaller and the more intricate and seemingly infinite we can get in terms of detail. I think he would say that, well, mechanism and finals and all these things, they're still getting to better understanding of these details, but are they really kind of bridging that gap in terms of, in the same way that he talks about, movement? Are they really talking about the movement itself, or are they just talking about these different points, and they're just getting more and more intricate and specific about the points along this movement, but still there's always this kind of remainder there that the intellect is not going to be able to pick up, because it's kind of retrospectively trying to put these things together into an assemblage of symbols and ideas and whatnot. So yeah, that's how I kind of see that.
Well, I'm glad that you're all talking about time and duration again, because it seems to me that most people who describe themselves as some type of evolutionist stress all the time, begging your pardon for that phrase, stress repeatedly that it is this very long period of time that can make the evolutionary sequence understandable and logical. That and we can't think of it in terms of human generations, that we're talking about, thousands upon thousands or even millions of years if you're going to go to the one-celled organisms floating around some body of water. So I mean, I understand. I think I understand what both Brad and you, Chase, are saying. If time is just merely a construct, well, then isn't space just merely a construct? I mean, but I don't think we experience, even empirically, barefooted empiricism would say that space doesn't exist. We drive a car over a certain amount of miles. We walk, we ride a bicycle, right? We get on an airplane. I don't think anybody would say, well, no, that's just how we talk about it. But really, space is like, no, of course space exists. And I think part of the problem is we are just having difficulty in conceptualizing time, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And look at the Greeks with their sense of what were the elements. I don't see how you could develop modern physics from earth, fire, water, and air. It simply is untenable. But that was because of their conceptual scheme, how they said these were the irreducible elements that make up our universe. Well, once people said, no, I think I think, and then, remember modern elements, right? The periodic chart of the elements. going from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. No one's ever explained why mathematics has just exploded. What is it about Arabic numerals that seems to lend itself to such an expansion of mathematical knowledge? And because we don't like to think of the symbol, do we, being determinative, that the form that these numbers are taking, the arbitrary shape that they are? What is it about this? And so if Arabic numerals could be so much more powerful in the development of mathematics, maybe we have to really play around with our concepts of time instead of just saying, no, time doesn't exist. And, it's going us down, having us go down a dead end.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the major disjunction isn't between the concept of space and the concept of time, but between quantity and quality. So, we can conceptualize time as a quantitative factor that we can plug into an equation. But I mean, as I think Bergson noted in the beginning of the chapter, this kind of effaces time. It like reduces it to logical categories. So like, I think, this is kind of what like McTaggart, for instance, is arguing with the irreality of time, is that like, time as a lived qualitative experience is what is illusory. We still need these two conceptual categories, time and space, to determine physical events. But and so I agree with you exactly that the issue is in how we conceptualize time. And I think Bergson's entire project, at least in a large part, is to kind of attempt to prove that there is a time, a duration that doesn't fit the form completely of a concept. Concepts being things that we intellectualize, things that we can like set beside each other and like move around according to our fancy, according to our like arbitrary will. Whereas, there is this quality of time that we're going to have to access in some way, which, I mean, it seems like, phenomenologically, this inability to turn backward, like the time that is duration is a time that does not function as concepts do. So I think this is the kind of the difficulty with, really, landing on like just reading this first chapter and being like, okay, well, how, why couldn't we just describe evolution with these like quantitative principles? I mean, I think Bergson is saying, yeah, we totally can, and we do it all the time, and it's useful and it helps out. But what is missed, and what only this like philosophical practice can access, is their qualitative reality, which is a temporal duration.
So I didn't, it seems very likely that, everything you're saying is correct, and that's where Bergson sees the big difference is in the notion of temporality. What I was going to say is I did not see that in this first chapter, because mostly what I see in this first chapter is him taking on mechanism and finalism on their own ground and saying, on your own ground, you cannot explain the evolution of complex organs. Whereas, some contemporary biologists would say, well, yeah, we can. But then, when I was thinking, so that duration, I don't see it really here. But then, what Chase was talking about, that especially the last part when he starts comparing the evolution of an eye to motion, and that illustration with the hand moving through the iron filings and all of that, maybe that is where duration actually is showing up, because there the distinction, and I'm probably just going to repeat some of the stuff Chase said, but the distinction seems to be a continuity of movement versus the accumulation of discrete parts. And so, maybe in terms of maybe if duration shows up here, it's in that difference. So that if maybe he would say, and I can't remember, it seems like something we talked about in the earlier part of the book, there was an illustration like this. I just can't remember it right now. But that once something has happened, you can look in the past and then you can explain that reductively, but that doesn't account for what's happening in the present and the trajectory toward the future. And so, maybe when I'm looking like that article I sent a link to a week or two ago, where people are talking about, this guy's talking about, here's all the evolutionary mechanisms we have, and here's how it can explain the evolution of the eye. And he even makes a comparison with the eye of the mollusk and talks about convergent evolution and all that kind of stuff. Maybe Bergson would say what science is doing is getting a finer and finer grained, discrete explanation of a process that was actually infinitely complex and continuous. And when he later in this book, when he in the last few, or in this section, the last few pages, when he was saying, this process is infinitely complex, I didn't really understand what he meant, because I think you've got discrete structures in the eye, right? You've got the lens, and you've got the retina, and you've got these nerves, and you've got these cells. But maybe what he's pointing to again is the difference between, he believes the process of evolution involves a continuity, a continuous movement. And then you can look back on it and say, oh, there were these discrete structures. And as science becomes more effective at giving those kinds of explanations, maybe it's kind of like, having a continuous line, the line of the real numbers, which, is in a sense infinitely complicated compared to like the natural numbers or something. And maybe it's like science is honing in on finer and finer and finer parts of that infinitely complex line, but that all that's going to happen is they're just going to keep getting more and more points. You know what I mean? I mean, the more you focus, you're just going to get the same infinity. No matter how many times you blow that thing up, you get the same infinity. That's the weirdness of the real numbers, the so-called power of the continuum, is the more you expand it, you don't get any fewer numbers. Same infinity, is no matter how big you make it. And so maybe Bergson would say that's what science is doing, is it's getting a finer and finer grained resolution on that continuous process retrospectively, but that the process is really a continuous process. And so maybe that's where duration kind of sneaks into this first chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that, I mean, the reason that I'm bringing duration in here is I think the first half of the chapter explicitly, when it's defining these differences between like simplicity and complexity, talking about endurance of the universe, talking about explicitly ties it to time and duration. So I think just it's operative throughout when he talks about like movement or simplicity as opposed to complexity or any of these things. Time and duration are the key concepts, quote unquote, that are in play here.
Yeah, I agree. I do think time is pretty important. I think that's kind of what he's getting to. I also feel like, yeah, what Chase is saying about the, like, our tendency to like take the eye, and just the fact that our tendency is to kind of separate it into these parts, like the retina, the cornea, and all the other, just the fact that we have this tendency towards separating them, I think he considers that problematic. And so in terms of time and in terms of mechanism and finalism, I think all of these things kind of, he's just pointing at this tendency of the intellect to break things down. And it reminds me a lot of kind of what Merleau-Ponty was arguing, is that like when our perception is built off of so many parts, that when we take those parts separately, we can tell very little about what they're going to create. We can see them and look at them, but we don't really know how they come together and create this whole. And I think that that's the same thing with like time and with these kind of machines and systems that he's talking about. Is like, we want to take it apart and we want to separate it, but with the eye specifically, all those parts are so interconnected that when we try to take it apart, we can actually tell very little about what it comes back to create, except in the sense that we can kind of retrospectively be like, oh, well, this makes sense now. You know, we're not really taking those parts for what they really are. So, yeah.
I was thinking of two things in that are very completely different from each other. When Nevitt was talking, when you were mentioning about change, is it continuity of movement versus discrete parts? And I'm just thinking of physics in the early 20th century with, is light a wave, you know, that Louis de Broglie said, versus Max Planck, no, is it, what did he call them, photons? I'm forgetting his term, but I think it was photons. And so you have two perfectly good, decent theories of light that are completely contradictory, to the point that physicists in the 1930s said, well, we'll teach light is a wave on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it's, the photon, the quanta of these bursts of energy on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. They used to have Saturday classes in universities. Consider yourself lucky. And a second completely different point is, what jumped out at me when I was reading I apologize, I'm going to pronounce Bergson like a guy from the Midwest, but that it's the creationists who always jump to the human eye to say, ta-da! You can't tell me that the human eye is somehow, through these bizarre series of accidents over thousands upon thousands of years, the eye is too well created to perform the function that it does, to be merely a consequence of accident. So I thought it was very interesting that Bergson is using human eye to try to get a handle, a lever on evolutionary process, where creationists are using the eye for the complete opposite reason.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, the point, especially about the kind of creationism, and that, that's just a version of finalism, like a not very sophisticated version of it. And I think he would see that as falling under the same kind of problem as mechanism, in terms of only seeing these things in terms of the intellect and looking at them as like a part by part, assemblage in the model of what is he talks about, instead of manufacturing, that's it, instead of organization. And he has like this this description where he talks about, in terms of the way that finalists see it. And it sounds a lot like, so at the bottom of 88, that's I think at the end, it's at the very beginning of the vital impetus, sort of. But he talks about basically the doctrine of finality, which says that the parts have been brought together on a preconceived plan with a view to a certain end. In this, it likens the labor of nature to that of the workman, who also proceeds by the assemblage of parts with a view to the realization of an idea or the imitation of a model. So there I'm definitely thinking of Plato and the Timaeus and the Demiurge, who uses the forms as this model that then creates that shapes this chaotic melange of this prime matter into the material world, which is an imperfect creation, or it's as perfect as he can do, but he's limited, I guess. So I think of that definitely, and that's interesting how that's kind of, so it's not necessarily just like a Christian idea. I think that's kind of showing that it goes back to this kind of Greek mentality that is what Bergson would probably say is still kind of intellectualizing these things and spatializing these things rather than seeing them as a kind of intuition and a kind of temporal becoming in a sense. So also what's interesting about that is, so he reproaches finalism as well as mechanism as basically having a kind of anthropomorphic character, that they're seeing these things in terms of the way that we create these mechanisms of manufacturing. And I think that goes back to also the way that we think in terms of science, because basically science is something that very much helps with this process. It almost serves this process as a kind of functionary of this process of manufacturing. And I think the kind of the danger with something like that is that, and what also kind of makes Bergson's idea kind of really kind of radical, is that he's kind of, I think you can see this in terms of, you know, social forces of science and technology and modernism that have brought us to, you know, where we are in terms that, you know, we're all talking to each other through these electronic video screens and whatnot. And the way that this has kind of occurred, it's also synonymous with a lot of these philosophies that he's kind of playing with. And that basically, you know, science is so bound to this manufacturing aspect that it has to serve those practical goals here of putting things together in terms of these parts. And I think it's really interesting to see these as not only, say mere philosophical problems, but this has a lot of, I think, refractions in the social dimension too, which I think is pretty interesting in terms of, you know, it's like what we were talking about with Funes the Memorius on Wednesday for the Borges story, in the sense that, you know, if you cut everything up into all these bits, and, you know, I think that, and then you give it a kind of reality in itself of there's only these elements, then you have a kind of danger there of seeing those only in terms of those elements, rather than having a sense of that we're actually kind of creating these things, that they're constantly in process. And, you know, we're using them in this practical way, but we can change them too, because we created them in the same way. So I think Bergson is kind of like opening us up to say, like, we can, you know, redefine these elements. You know, the idea isn't to get rid of the intellect. The idea isn't to remove all this science and, you know, instead it's, let's see what exactly is working, but let's take into consideration, you know, the creative act of doing all these things, and that we know we can, in a sense, redefine these elements in these terms and whatnot, and do something else, something new. So, yeah, I think that's interesting.
So you know, when you talk about Plato, one of my constant refrains in the 19th century class was that Western philosophy has a horror of, I'm not sure what it was, change or time or something. And so, you know, if you look at like Plato, the phenomenal world is this world of shifty, changey mush, and that can't possibly be the real, because the real has got to be something the intellect can latch onto. I mean, literally, you know, the reason the forms are changeless, and since for something to be in the fullest sense of being, it's got to be changeless. And so the forms exist in the fullest sense of the word to be, whereas this mush down here in phenomena, it's, you know, it's becoming and so on. And then the same thing with knowledge. The mind, a rational mind can't latch on to a concept unless that concept is absolutely stable. And the forms, since they're eternal and changeless, are absolutely stable. And so, you know, the forms have to be unchanging, whereas this icky stuff down here is just sort of kind of real. And then, you see a similar thing with Kant, with the categories must be the real framework for reality because they're stable and a priori and unchanging. And then you've got this manifold of sensory intuition that comes in and it's all mushy and unintelligible. And the rational mind organizes it, so it makes it all pretty and fits in the nice conceptions. And then you get, people like Merleau-Ponty. I see, I can see these connections between these guys saying, no, fundamentally the real is the way the body engages with the continuity of perception, and that intentionality of the body is preconceptual, pre-rational, and so we don't have immediate cognitive access to it. And then it seems like Bergson is saying something similar, which, I don't know where he's going exactly, because I read this book years ago in a class, but it's been too long, but that whatever it is that intuition accesses, it's going to be, I'm guessing, something that this conceptual intellect is not able to latch onto, and so it seems like, well, you see it with Nietzsche, Nietzsche's, I mentioned this to Brad in an email. Nietzsche says there are no things because the field of awareness is like a continuum, not exact. It's not a homogeneous continuum, but it's a continuum that has lumps and variations of density and tone and color. But it's not things. It's just a bunch of stuff. And so it seems like some of these late 19th, early 20th century philosophers are trying to say, no, the field of the real is that mushy stuff, and that the intellect, one, can't grasp it, and then, as Chase is pointing out, can't manipulate it unless it can reduce it into these clear categories and forms. And so, anyway, I think that's an interesting historical connection.
Nevitt, are you saying that Plato and Kant are Gnostics?
I will let Chase answer that question. I don't know enough about Gnosticism.
I think Plato was to a certain degree. Kant, he's more just, in Nietzsche's terms, a sneaky Christian. I can kind of see that. So I think, I don't know, Kant is just too rigidly orthodox in a certain degree. In another degree, he's radical, but he's like Descartes radical, which is basically like a superficial radical that ultimately just reinserts itself back into orthodoxy. So I think Plato could be considered a kind of Gnostic to a certain. He was somewhat engaging in the mystery religions, where you can trace back Gnosticism to some of those kind of ritualistic, kind of ecstatic experiences that people had in the mystery religions. But that's a whole nother topic that, we don't need to go down. But so one thing, in terms of Merleau-Ponty, and also with what exactly is he doing in terms of like how he's organizing his chapter and whatnot? This did remind me a lot of Merleau-Ponty in the sense that he uses this kind of dialectical approach in the sense that, Merleau-Ponty, he was talking about empiricism and intellectualism. And here I see that's kind of like or for Bergson, that's mechanism and finalism here. And so he kind of plays those off against each other and then shows basically how neither of them really fully grasp what's going on with this phenomena of, whether it's perception or evolution or whatever it is. And then he presents something else that kind of takes some from those other ideas, but ultimately I think he's trying to show that they're incomplete. They need something else to kind of fill in the gap. And I think that's very much what both Bergson and Merleau-Ponty were doing, except thank you, Bergson, so much for actually being clear on when you are arguing your own point and when you are not arguing your own point. Like, he's very clear when he's saying mechanism says this, finalism says this. Merleau-Ponty, it was so difficult to figure out. You know, he would go on for like 8 pages and like, is this his argument? What is going on here? Until eventually he's like, oh, and this is wrong. This is empiricism. Like, what? Okay, I don't know. So I don't. Bergson is so much more clear as a writer in terms of, you know, how he's trying to like organize these things. So thank you, Bergson, very much for that. It's so much easier to read. But I forgot what my original point was going to be, so I'm just going to end there.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by the very last sentence where he talks about how, you know, we're moving forward, we're going to show that the divergent results of evolution do not present analogies, but are mutually complementary. And I mean, a lot of the language he's using, I think is specifically rooted in Kant. So for Kant, like the entire antinomy is about like, the impossibility of like rationally accessing a determinate like rational cosmology. So, you know, there's 2 ways to approach nature. I can do it from the perspective of what, you know, and it's interesting, we also brought in the difference between like evolutionism and creationism here too, because it's like, on the one hand, like I can approach everything mechanistically and talk about like things as like machines, like amalgamations of parts. But you know, Kant's whole thing is like, well, you know, you can never, if you can say that all these things are like determinate pieces of a larger puzzle, but rationally, we can never access a piece that isn't precisely that, like a piece that refers to other parts. So if we wanted to try to access like the fundamental piece that started it all, like the origin of the thing, we just can't do it. So we have to like the one half of the antinomy is like, we just have to, you know, approach everything mechanistically, which I think would result in like a radical atheism or something, like a, you know, there's only these parts that fit together. But, you know, the other half of that is like, well, since we know that everything has a cause, then the entire system has to have a cause. So we need to approach it as like creationists. There must be some unmoved mover or like first cause that sets all this in motion. Just, you know, that's just the way that, you know, reason has to determine causal series. I mean, and so Kant ultimately lands on the thing is like, well, we can never decide between these, like, because we don't have access to the first cause, we don't have perceptual access or rational access to the actual first cause. We have to just recognize that we've reached an antinomy that we can't ever finally decide between. And so, you know, for Kant, we have 2 options, and we can only determine, like, we can function through analogy. We could say like, and I think, you know, Bergson also recognizes this when he always says like, oh, mechanism ultimately has to act as if, you know, it can deny philosophically that there is some sort of intelligent principle moving this entire process forward. But, you know, in order to explain certain things, we have to act as if there was somebody setting it all up. So ultimately, finalism and mechanism are like inextricable. They go together because they both explain things that the others can't. I think, you know, moving into, I mean, it seems that Bergson is going to like present a sort of like proto phenomenology in the sense that like, you know, like Husserl, for instance, was like, he kind of recognizes, he's like, okay, so we have all these different like worlds, like all these different like regions of objects that require their own linguistic frameworks. Where do all of these things come together? They come together in living consciousness. So it seems like what Bergson is going to do is say like, yeah, we have all of these different ways of looking at things, but they're all incomplete. The only thing that can tie them all together to not make them, which rationally would be contradictory and impossible, is, you know, our living experience, like where all of these things are present in a sort of vague sense. So, I mean, Yeah, no, I think just to emphasize what Chase was saying, like there is these two like the question of like mechanism and finalism are precisely like just taken to their logical limits our own experience of our rational functioning and of our like use of objects in the world. But I think Bergson's entire point is going to be like, we can move beyond Kant. Like we don't have to say that like there are just these two things and we can just act as if there's some like rational principle driving things. We can kind of access a principle that will hold these both together as like a living like vital impetus, like some sort of like life principle. I think it's also important to note that like what he's doing is trying to define like life in a way that doesn't fall prey to anthropomorphism or the kind of mistake that would lead like certain contemporary thinkers would like define like computer programs as living based on this like mechanistic interpretation of what living systems do. I think Bergson is going to want to give us a way. I mean, not as prescient. I mean, I think we can use him as a way to avoid both a sort of like naive creationism and like positing some sort of like personal anthropomorphic God at the basis of things, but also a way that we can distinguish life from just like a computer virus or something. There's like some sort of like determinate living principle that operates differently than just putting parts together in a machine.
I don't know if any of you are familiar with the name Keith Ansel Pearson. He's a guy at Warwick University, and he's written a lot on various continental thinkers. But I stumbled into an article of his called Bergson's Encounter with Biology from 2009. And I just mentioning it because he tries to make a case in this article, and I guess it's from a journal, that Bergson is still relevant in contemporary discussions of biology. And he specifically talks about creative evolution and Bergson's interaction with Kant, even though it wasn't, he doesn't say the name Kant, but kind of like Brad is saying, Kant is kind of hovering in the background, and he's kind of talking to Kant over his shoulder and mentions Aristotle. So anyway, I just skimmed that article like most of these things, but I'll send that to you guys by email. So if you're, we don't have to talk about it. I'm not suggesting we make it, but it gives you a view as to why Bergson might still be relevant by a contemporary philosopher.
I've been meaning to read some of his books. I don't think I actually have, though. I think I've skimmed maybe like some of his articles or whatnot, but yeah, he seems like a pretty interesting thinker along this whole kind of like a continental process philosophy kind of thing. I think his big thing is kind of like he has books on Nietzsche and Bergson and Deleuze, and I think those are kind of like his three main people, but yeah, pretty interesting. But so to kind of touch on something that Brad was talking about in terms of, where does this all about, the idea of like living experience as something that is kind of, that he's kind of, appealing to or whatnot, as a way to kind of get past these kind of, this antinomy between these two different contradictory approaches with mechanism and finalism. That one way I saw it is that this is kind of like a rehash of like the subject-object dichotomy, and that mechanism is solely object-focused, and finalism is very much subject-focused. And I think what Bergson is wanting to do is show how actually, in a way, both of these are connected in a kind of continuous way of where they're mixed together, and this made me think a lot of Whitehead, which I apologize to the people that, haven't read Whitehead or were not part of that seminar or whatnot. But basically what Whitehead says is that, every subject has to have some kind of a object involved with it. They're kind of like two poles of the same process. There's both like a subject and an objective pole. So he says basically every subject is also kind of a superject. And in the same way that every object also has a kind of like an inject or an injection that has like this interior kind of depth dimension to go along with every kind of objective, external dimension to it, so that these things necessarily form a indivisible continuity with each other. And I think that's where he's getting at with this idea of like a psychological force with these things. And that, so I think his use of the term psychology isn't a good one, because it makes us think of something totally different, I think. But I think what he's kind of trying to get there is, I think you can think of psychology in terms of its old etymology, the psyche, the psyche, as a kind of, it's kind of like the Latin anima, which is a kind of vital impetus, really. Which is, but also, I think in terms of experience, that's one way you can or the event, something like that. Those are things that I think process philosophy and Whitehead did a good job of showing that the subject and object kind of come together in those things. And I think that's where he's trying to go in terms of also showing that basically this kind of flow of the impetus of these things, and the way that it's kind of an action, but it's also a kind of psychological effort, as he says, that's not an individual anthropomorphic effort of the conscious mind, but something much deeper. So I think it's interesting to kind of compare that to what Whitehead was saying, and also to just this kind of notion of a subject-object dichotomy, and that he's kind of challenging that dichotomy by showing also a continuity between all those as well. Yeah.
There's a part that I liked on page 73 of my edition, where he talks about like different types of causes, or at least like how they can be confused. He says a cause may act by impelling, releasing, or unwinding. And then he kind of explains that the first, quantity and quality, vary with the quantity and quality of the cause. So that, the quality and quantity of the effect vary with the quantity and quality of the cause. And the second, neither quality nor quantity of the effect varies with quality and quantity of the cause. And then in the third, the quantity of the effect depends on the quantity of the cause, but the cause does not influence the quality of the effect. So I think that I don't know where it fits in this discussion, but I think to me it kind of adds this more like, and he even says at the beginning, without undertaking an exhaustive analysis of the idea of causality, he's kind of just, explaining that this cause and effect way that we kind of analyze science with has so many different ways and perspectives that can be taken, and to like, to have an effect and then try and go back and figure out the cause without admitting some sort of non-intellect is happening, some sort of intuition or something separate would be dishonest.
So he kind of goes back to that notion also. So when he first said that, I thought he was going to kind of talk more about it, and he kind of, I can't remember exactly what he did with it right there in terms. Yeah, I guess that's not as important, but one thing I think that was kind of interesting is that he did kind of go back to those different notions of cause by saying that, so when he gives his example By the way, also Bergson, the way he uses examples and these images is so much more helpful than Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty did not do a very good job of that, but nevertheless. Oh, by the way, instead of Schneider, I think we get the eye here. Basically, the convergent evolution of the eye is just his version of Schneider in a sense. But I think what's going on with these different causes, he kind of goes back and says that, the invisible hand that kind of goes through the filings as this effort and this movement, and then after the movement is exhausted, it leaves this kind of mold of the pens. And he says, well, what's the cause of that? And he's basically saying, this isn't a case of like a simple, efficient cause, which is always what we think of it in terms of, this analysis of, generally like the impelling cause. I believe that's the kind of like efficient mechanistic one, where, well, let's explain the location of the pins by the action of the pin next to it. Or let's explain it in terms of the plan, the idea, and the very anthropomorphic intention of moving your hand through it. It's like the finalist idea. But he says there's a kind of gap between the cause necessarily, and there's like one-to-one correlation with the effect and the form that it takes, which I think is interesting, because that's kind of like, I think what he would say is like a releasing cause. He doesn't really say this, so I may be totally wrong in making this connection, but I think it's interesting in that he then connects that with kind of his critique on determinism, that as a complete determinism, at least, that mechanism would make. Because he's saying basically, like the impetus of life, the vital principle or whatnot, the movement, it is in a sense the cause of these forms of, the different forms of the eye and whatnot, but it's not a mechanistic cause in that sense. It's more of a releasing cause that allows it to have its own kind of expression on its own in a way that's like partially determinate, but also partially indeterminate. So I thought that was really interesting how he kind of sees it as a cause, but he's still giving it kind of this room to breathe and to have its own kind of indeterminate novelty on its own. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting.
I have a question about where that argument is headed. And in fact, I have a bunch of questions, but, as usual, right? But the cause, impelling, releasing, and unwinding, right? After going over these notions of impelling, releasing, and unwinding, and saying that outside forces may make organic structures form to it better and better, and kind of trying to, he keeps seeming like he's done talking about mechanism and accidents. Like he's like, that's it. Their goose is cooked. I'm done talking about mechanism. And he just keeps coming back to it and just beating it like every couple pages. But so I wrote down, I was like, okay, so scratch mechanism, get that out of here, right? Right after he's talking about these difference in causes and how that complicates things, this thing between, like Joey said in the chat, something between releasing and unwinding. But I have a question, because after that, on page 75 and 76, before he starts talking about Lamarck. So he's talking about regeneration. He says, okay, we're looking at all these variations between lines of evolution. Well, we don't have to do that with all these different species. We can just do it with one animal. Let's look at regeneration. What does regeneration have? That we can, but yeah, the very end of orthogenesis. Exactly. Thank you, Nida. So from the first paragraph, it says, the more we reflect upon it, the more we see that this production of the same effect by two different accumulations of an enormous number of small causes is contrary to the principles of mechanistic philosophy, yada, yada, yada. It seems like he is arguing that there is a directing principle, right? Which I'm also curious is the difference between a manufactured and organized machine, Ed. But I that's one of my questions. But he seems to be arguing that regeneration is this guiding or directing principle which allows for different parts of the eye to be cut and to regenerate different parts of the eye with different parts. Just there's no rhyme or to him. It seems like there's no center of regeneration. The whole thing is just capable of regenerating in this holistic way. And he's pointing to this notion of a directing principle that accounts for a convergence of effects in the regeneration. But is this guiding, to me, it seems like this is why I was talking in the group chat the other night. I said this guiding principle is supposedly this thing between releasing and unwinding, which he later on at the very end of the chapter describes as life as a tendency to act on matter, on inert matter. This original impetus of life, is that just a genetic sequence? Is that like the implicate, like in a way, because when I think about regeneration, specifically, when I think about the regeneration of bodily structures, I'm a neophyte in terms of my biological knowledge, but I am under the impression that my body knows how to regenerate because there is a structured genetic sequence that tells it what kind of cells to make next to what. You know what I mean? Or each cell has a nucleus full of I don't really know anything about DNA, but just the point being, I'm currently under the, or have been under the impression that there's a genetic sequence that is guiding my behavior, or not my behavior, but my body's regenerative behaviors, you know? And that's what he's saying is, am I confused here? Or does that alter the character of his argument? Or would you say, maybe it stays the same?
My first kind of thought is whether or not our perception of DNA does not exist in the same exact thing as time and as all these other things that he has problem with mechanistically. You know, if we're looking at DNA mechanistically rather than as a whole, and we're looking at, and we're obviously dividing it up into parts, and we're, you know, looking at those individual parts and what they mean, and yet we don't really have an understanding of like 95% of what's going on, you know, that makes me feel like maybe even our perception of DNA is wrong, even though we kind of have, obviously our perception of biology as a whole is developed from it. You know, if we were to understand DNA in such a structured and specific way, then maybe that's a problem. But again, I don't know about DNA that much.
So one thing that I've read about DNA, and you know, I don't know a lot about this to judge whether it's really how legitimate or what way it's legitimate exactly. But one thing I read was that what science does understand about DNA is not exactly, but generally how it's able to transcribe amino acids and proteins to then give kind of these basic processes that basically transcribe these processes into actually fulfilling themselves. But what they don't know is exactly how DNA kind of selects from itself in order to choose those processes to pick. So they basically know how DNA works after these processes have been selected to transcribe something definite, these definite combinations of amino acids and whatnot, but they don't exactly know how those selections are made. I'm giving a very probably bad, incorrect explanation there, but there's something like that, which maybe that has something to do with like what you're talking about DNA. But yeah, a lot of interesting points beforehand, but I'm just going to see if anyone else wants to answer some of those things before I rant too much.
I mean, to me, it seems like he's introducing these three notions of causes to kind of like gesture towards the fact that like the effect or like the affected organism's own constitution plays an active role in the latter two type of causes, where in the first type of cause, the effect is entirely determined by the nature of the cause and its action. So, when he's saying that it's like the evolutionary causality in this type of crab or whatever, butterfly, whichever organism is being referred to here, is between unwinding and releasing. He's saying like, so the releasing was the example he gives is like gunpowder. There's something determinate in the effect itself, or in the organism that is affected, that causes a specific type of effect, regardless of what the cause is, like in which way the gunpowder is lit. The unwinding is like the music coming out of the music producer. I'm not going to look at whatever apparatus he's referring to here, but it's like it only comes on insofar as the cause is acting, but the cause doesn't determine like the quality of the sound, or like the song, the melody that comes out. So when he's saying that it's intermediary here, what I take him as saying is that both the organism has an inner determinate like already constitutive tendency to react in a particular way, and that tendency is sort of unfolded according to the intensity of the cause that's enacted upon it to cause that thing to start happening. I think kind of underneath all this, and this also I think is related to the different notions of like adaptation that he gives, and what was the other one that he uses? Adaptation and correlation. There's kind of like a critical philosophy of language that's underlying all of this, which I think is really interesting. He explicitly uses like the word paralogism in defining like the type of fallacy that's included in using one word and being ambiguous about which definition you're using. So like a paralogism is a fallacy of like a categorical syllogism. The fallacy is also called the fallacy of the ambiguous middle, where I would use, famously, like there's a whole, so Kant has a whole section on paralogisms when he's determining like the impossibility of a rational psychology. And it's like, the first one that he gives is like, for any of my representations, that which must necessarily be a subject is substance. I am the subject of all of my representations, therefore I am a substance. The issue is that you're starting with like a very general definition of representations representation. So like a logical, for anything that's a subject, like the definition of substance is the subject of all representations. And then you're using an empirical determination in the minor term, which is like, I am the subject of my representations, and pretending that is like according to the same definition of subject in the first term. So whereas in the minor term, I'm just talking about like a specific representation, like I am, like when I say I'm just talking about a particular representation that I'm having, not all possible representations that I have ever had or something like that. And so I'm just like, it's also called the fallacy of equivocation. I saw that in the chat. So like, yeah, I'm equivocating between terms. So it seems like, what's important in this section in particular is this sort of critical linguistic philosophy of like, marking out like, so when the radical mechanists say like, oh, like the engine producing heat or something, the engine is the cause of the heat. And then they turn to like an organic or like evolutionary cause and say like, X is the cause of Y. They're equivocating between these notions of cause. So they build up this entire theoretical apparatus based around a mechanistic explanation of cause and effect. Finalists would do the same thing. They would say like, oh, well, like the watchmaker is the cause of the watch. There are these complex systems there are these complex systems that we see now, like in nature. So there must be like an anthropomorphic cause or like an intelligent cause as well here. Again, they're equivocating between these different notions. So I think that, so the key here is that like, when we use the word cause, the way that we use it will determine whether we are interpreting the phenomena mechanistically through a sort of finalism, or in this more like evolutionarily adequate way.
So one thing that I think is interesting about, first of all, that I'm not sure if that makes me want to read more Kant, like the Critique of Pure Reason, or it makes me actually like more terrified of it than ever. But anyways, I think it's interesting that he's kind of so what he's kind of doing in this book is he's kind of like taking these different scientific ideas, really kind of giving his own like philosophical kind of critique of it. And I think that's interesting in terms of, especially modern day where science and, just the social drive for manufacturing and technology, to the point where it's essentially an autonomous system that we're all just kind of functionaries of. That basically philosophy, it's like where does philosophy really play its part in any of this? And that's why all of our funding gets cut, and that's why thanks Texas State for revoking my assistantship and all that. And yeah, so where exactly does our part play in this? I think Bergson, by kind of giving like that critique, that critical critique of language, it's very interesting to show how philosophy can play a part in determining different ideas in science. It would actually probably be helpful for science itself. And one of them is that they're constantly kind of invoking this equivocation of their terms. Because ultimately, yeah, what is, science definitely is using, a lot of it is, quantification and mathematics and, cold hard data. But then there is this kind of guiding principle of hypotheses and theories and ideas. And in those terms, especially, they become a kind of limiting construct. And I think what he's kind of trying to do by critiquing those ideas is show essentially, how exactly they're limiting those ideas, or kind of trying to, they'll get these results in some cases, but then through this kind of equivocation, they'll then use those terms to kind of bring back into this very limited philosophy of, mechanism or finalism or whatnot. And instead, he's kind of trying to give almost like a plurality and open these up by showing that actually there's really a complication, a perplexion of these ideas when they can't all just be subsumed into one terminology that's used in all these different ways. And I think that's interesting as a big part of what he's doing by critiquing these ideas, and not just in terms of showing that they don't fully explain, say, like the complexity of the eye, but in their very kind of almost naive limitation that they don't feel the need often to really engage in like this critical analysis of language and logic and things like that. And that look at just like people like Stephen Hawking or Neil deGrasse Tyson say basically philosophy is essentially worthless, that science has usurped philosophy to the point where philosophy is basically just a artifact of the past, a superstition, that's just like magical thinking and whatnot. And now we're so beyond that, well, I guess by now this has become like a bitter rant of my own that's personal, but I'll just leave it at that.
If someone really wants to go on, but I've been thinking in reading this creative evolution and all of your comments for this time and the previous two times, there's to me a parallelism with the biological discussion with the ideas of the universe. And from my reading of the history of science, as late as the 1800s, physicists thought that the universe always was, and it was always going to be. And the only opposition to that was in Genesis, right? But then with, I guess, as a consequence of Einstein's general and special theory of relativity, we have the Big Bang theory, right? I don't think anybody thinks that the Big Bang, well, I don't want to say it that way. Does anybody think the Big Bang theory is smuggling in God? Or do they see the Big Bang theory as a co-equal explanation for the eternal universe on one side, and in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth? Compare that to biology. If you have creationism on one end and evolution, however defined, on the other, do any of you equate intelligent design just as Chase, did you describe Kant as a sly Christian, or but do you view the intelligent design as standing on its own, or is it just really creationism under a different name?
So in terms of intelligent design as a science, I think that is basically just reactionary. That the same way a lot of modern day fundamentalist Christianity is reactionary in the sense that it's reacting against different kind of liberal strains of interpretation that were coming out. But yeah, I see the Big Bang as probably more in common with like a ex nihilo idea of creation, although I think they would say, well, the agent of creation is something that's eternal, sorry, I'm confusing it with just the actual creation of Genesis. But that's where I think they definitely have an ex nihilo idea of creation there, in the sense that time didn't exist before, but then it came into being then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, that the universe kind of sprang essentially from nothing, at least that we can talk about. So it's at that point, at least, I don't know, language kind of falls apart when you're trying to talk about processes that are happening outside of time, or something that exists outside of time. Basically, either that doesn't make any ontological sense, or it doesn't make any sense in a way that I think the human mind can understand it, or the language can talk about it. So either way, it kind of ends in the same kind of antinomy, I guess. But I think that answered your question.
This is taking us even further off topic, but just to give you an idea of how smart those Christians are, there's a question. One of the questions that Thomas Aquinas tried to answer, I can't remember if it was in the Summa Theologica or somewhere else, but how could God create without there being a change in God? Because God is supposed to be changeless, and creation seems to be a change. And so what he says is that God created time and space at the same point. But since God created time at that point, there was no time prior to that, which means there couldn't be any change because there was no time. And so the universe just starts, and time starts there. And since there was no time prior to that, you can't say that was a change in God. Anyway, damn smart.
It sounds exactly like the Big Bang.
It does.
Really. Yeah.
Well, but
one of my
point.
questions when people say, well, there would have had to have been a God to start the Big Bang. And, my response is, well, well, then where did God come from? And they say, well, God's always been. Well, how is that? How is the Big Bang just going out of nothing any weirder than saying there's a God that's always been? I mean, one doesn't seem to make any less sense than the other.
Well, it's just, my point was, if this were the 1880s and someone said, you know, I think there was a time when the universe didn't exist, and then there was just gigantic explosion, would some physicists say to that physicist, don't give me the Genesis story? But now the Big Bang Theory is accepted, quote unquote, scientifically. I mean, Stephen, I'm forgetting the physicist's last name, Greenberg or Goldberg, actually wrote a book, The First 3 Minutes of the Universe. And there's been a lot of work done, which I find interesting because, like, how? But on the very beginning of the universe. And scientists are accepting the Big Bang Theory as a scientific theory.
Yeah, but there's also been, I don't know much about this, but you know, apparently if you roll the time backwards, depending on how the mathematics works out, instead of ending up at a particular point in time, you end up with this kind of curve which suggests there was no particular time in which the universe began. I don't even know what that means. And then you've got these other theories that say there are these brains, you know, these membranes of, you know, I don't even know what those are either. And they're kind of, you know, waving around in some multi-dimensional domain, and they bump into each other, and then that's what a Big Bang is. And so, you know.
Yeah, that's M theory, which is kind of an updated version of string theory, like Alex pointed out just now. But yeah, I guess that's a little off topic, so I'm not going to go into that.
No, it was Steven Weinberg who wrote a book, The First 3 Minutes. Thank you, Alex.
What comes to mind for me is something that we talked about in the Whitehead seminar, and I think is also included in that Bergson essay that I just shared to the chat. We talked about with Whitehead that there are different epochs, and right now we're living in like the electromagnetic epoch. In this essay that Bergson writes, he writes, you know, he talks about like nothingness. Like we constantly have this question, this philosophical question that he sees as a pseudo problem, like why is there nothing or something rather than nothing? But nothing only makes any sense at all in relation to the concept of something. So I think what Bergson says is like nothing is just an order that we haven't found yet or can't conceptualize yet. So I mean, I think you can kind of again like have your cake and eat it too there. I mean, we can talk about the Big Bang as the origin of this particular universe that's defined by certain physical laws, has certain characteristics, but you know, to pass over into like, well, what came before that, I think you're passing over into like a metaphysical problem, and you're no longer, it's like outside of the realm of science. So like science can perceive the entities that it allows, like that it, I mean, ultimately defines as like, you know, what is perceptible. But you know, if we're getting into these paradoxes, then we're not really, you know, dealing with that type of like epistemological access anymore. So I think that like, yeah, again, you can kind of do a little bit of, there's still open, you know, room there for like, as Nevitt was saying, like, I mean, Augustine has a whole famous chapter on time as well in the Confessions, where he kind of is worrying about these problems where it's just like, you know, how could there be a time before time, you know? And even contemporary philosophers, like there's a really great lecture by a contemporary Schelling scholar that I think the way he puts it is like, you know, like I'm on my time bus, like where does the time bus enter the universe? You know, where do I get on and off the time bus? If there wasn't time, then how is the time of like, when did I get on the time bus if it was some time before time, you know, like, so yeah, I think these issues are, you know, still at least philosophically, you know, being fought out.
I wanted to read something as we're getting closer to the end. This is on the second to the last page of this section. So it's like the penultimate paragraph. You know, because one of the questions I'm wondering is, what is this vital impetus? And I'm guessing he's going to fill this out as we go along. so this is just preliminary. But this was helpful to me. Halfway through that paragraph, he says, life is more than anything else a tendency to act on inert matter. The direction of this action is not predetermined, hence the unforeseeable variety of forms which life, in evolving, sows along its path. But this action always presents, to some extent, the character of contingency. It implies at least a rudiment of choice. Now a choice involves the anticipatory idea of several possible actions. Possibilities of actions must therefore be marked out before the living being, before the action itself. And so I thought, it's an interesting, because when Hunter was talking earlier, it sounded like it was finalism, like there's something that this is headed toward, and that's why we can get an I, because it's headed toward the I. But this suggests that no, life is just and I don't know exactly what it means, a tendency to act on inert matter. Maybe he's going to flesh that out more, like a tendency to do what? Organize it, a tendency to, make, this is the very last page of the book. In this edition, it's this, well, none of you have this edition. It's the second to the last paragraph in the whole chapter. Sorry, not the book, the whole chapter. Second to last paragraph. But when he says that this impetus seems to mark out a range of possibilities, that's what the impetus does, apparently, is it marks out a range of possibilities, and maybe an infinite range. I mean, he doesn't say it's a discrete set of possibilities. Maybe it's an entire, maybe it's a continuum of possibility, or maybe it's who knows, I don't know how many possibilities. But the impetus, what it seems like the impetus does is it doesn't aim toward a particular goal, but it aims in a particular direction. And that direction constitutes a series of, a bunch of possibilities. And then which possibility occurs is contingent. And when he says choice there, I'm guessing, but he's talking about evolution. I don't, and maybe again, like Chase was saying, maybe this is where he's using these words like psychology and here choice. I'm not taking choice there as literal, as in choice of a human being or choice of a God, but rather as a choice that's made by particular environmental contingencies, for example. So maybe that's why he would say you get a mollusk eye in one situation, but you get a vertebrate eye in another situation, but you still got eyes. And so that there's this range of possibilities that the impetus produces, and then the conditions will then, in a sense, pick out some possibility and begin to pursue that. And I'm also skeptical that this is going to, that this is sort of an indeterminacy, in the sense of the future has a direction of some kind, but it's a pretty broad direction that has a bunch of possibilities. I seriously doubt we're going to get anything like a robust theory of free human will out of this. I think it's going to be, I still like, the way that Travis was talking about it last time, you may in retrospect looking back, this is me just guessing because it seemed to fit with what Bergson was saying, but you might have a certain indeterminacy in human choice, but that doesn't mean that's going to end up being, I am a free agent that can make an independent choice. It's probably going to be less satisfying than that, at least if you want to be a radical libertarian in the free will sense, not the political sense.
But at the same time, the opposite, if there are determining factors. Yes, I exist as a member of a chain of causes and effects, and I get if the goalpost is to argue that I don't participate in causes and effects, and that's the only way to be free, then I'm dead in the water. But I think that there have been a lot of arguments. There's this guy named Massimo Pigliucci, who is this Italian Stoic who I like a little bit. But he's very adamant about, like, yes, you are still a member of a chain of cause and effects, but that does not imply that you're a puppet on strings. You're not like you're not this unfree agent of another being's determined idea as to what you're supposed to be, or just a result of determining factors entirely, in the sense that you and I still get to make choices. You know, these choices are conditioned, but the condition is the only way that those choices can be meaningful. If I'm outside of causes and effects, then I live in random world and nothing means anything, and I'm just kind of shouting into a void. And at that point, I'm barely free at all. I'm just subject to the randomness of it all. But the conditions of my choices allow those choices to exist in the first place, allow those choices to be meaningful and to have moral and ethical implications, you know? But something that I thought was interesting that I just, before the seminar ends for today, I was curious about a certain idea, like if anybody has a different way to word this thing Bergson keeps saying. I'm just super interested in it, and I can't make heads or tails of it. And it's this negativity of life, this inherent negativity, in the sense that he says, like, on page 89, he's talking about life as a process of dissociation and division. On page 93, he's talking about means employed rather than obstacles avoided. He's saying life is about avoiding obstacles rather than employing a means. And he's saying that mechanism and finalism are these positivisms. They're these positive philosophies where they're adding pieces together to create this structure. But he says, no, life is a negativity. Life is a deterrence. Life is an avoidance. Life is a overcoming of obstacles rather than an employment of means. And I really am interested in that because negativity comes up a lot in a lot of the people I read. And I was thinking, like, days, like, as I've been reading this, like, oh, you know, I can't wait to have something to say about that once I figure out what he's talking about. But I never quite reached it. And now here we are at the end of the seminar. So does anybody have anything at all?
I'm looking at that page where he mentions the negation rather than a positive reality. And at least right below there is where he talks about, like, his theory of vision and whatnot. He uses that word canalized. And I think there he's kind of pointing to the fact that his kind of theory of vision, and I think he even references it on the page before the end, and he references matter and memory. And in matter and memory, he talks about how vision is a more so like a process of negation, where it's like excluding things as a way of presenting us with options. And that's how I'm reading that. And that, like, life is a negation, kind of like in that sentence where he says, life has a tendency to act on inert matter. And, like, what kind of act is that? Is that a negative act where it kind of carves out something from it, as opposed to adding anything to it, as opposed to a sum of means employed?
Yeah, I mean, I think this ties all back into what Nevitt was saying about, you know, or asking whether, like, the possibilities are infinite or determinate. I think the latter is true, because this negative, like, in order for something to be a possible avenue of action, it has to be determined in some sense. I mean, in order for something to be acted upon, it has to, like, conform to the criteria of human action. So I think this, like, I mean, the eye, in the way that it accesses objects, accesses them in such a way that the organism can act on them. But I think in order to make that, like, conform to the specific possibility of action of an organism, it has to exclude, you know, what would not be a viable avenue for action or something. I was just reading this as sort of like, you know, in creating the pathways towards something that can actually, you know, not just theoretically be acted upon, but actually lead to the enactment of something or other.
Yeah, I see that. So I definitely think he's not a full libertarian. He's more talking about how these there's kind of like degrees, or that they kind of like work together, that there has to be, you know, in some sense, some kind of determination, but then also it's almost like there's work being done on determination to kind of give it some kind of indetermination in a sense. But Yeah, I think this idea of like the negativity and whatnot is what he's saying there, like what he talks about in perception and what Joe's talking about in terms of matter and memory, is that it's more a process of kind of selection that is going on, and that's what it's being kind of cut out of, or it's being kind of, so basically, if you were aware of, absolutely everything in its full positivity, like what Funes talks about, then you would be incapable of movement. You would be incapable, because really what it comes down to is you have to have some kind of discriminatory power to cancel out some degrees of the positivity of, whether it's the particularity or the extreme complexity or whatever it is of these things, in order to simplify it into these different avenues of possible choice, and I think that's more what he's talking about in terms of negativity. And also that I think another thing I read is that he sees the idea of divergence in evolution as is a very important notion. Instead of I think instead of thinking in terms of, once again, like an assembly of parts or whatnot, he wants to see like that there's this like original impetus in some sense, and that it creates a kind of divergence of itself, yet that there's still something contained though in those divergences. So I think it's more probably, I like to think of it more in that sense of divergence rather than negativity. And I think also, instead of necessarily negativity, also in the sense of like, the idea of like choice or possibility, it's more kind of like selection or canalization. I think that's the term he uses. Yeah, so that's the way I kind of see that. Also, I do have, there's some stuff I read in this book by John Malarkey that has to do specifically with that idea of not only his like critique on negativity or nothingness, but also his idea particularly on like divergence and negativity. So I could send you some of that stuff if you wanted through group chat or whatever, but yeah.
Joey, did you?
I was going to say, I like that example he gives of digging a canal versus like heaping up of earth, or like thinking of a canal as if it were the heaping up of the banks, and how like fallacious that would be.
Is that what he means by canalization then? Because I didn't know what he really meant by that word, and then he gave that illustration, and then I remember, doesn't Merleau-Ponty use that word, or maybe it was Whitehead? Somebody else used that word, and I never really understood what that meant.
Yeah, I see as like you're given like a flat surface, and by digging a canal, you kind of carve out a path for yourself, and that's the way that vision kind of carves out like eventual possibilities for you to choose from.
I think I recall Merleau-Ponty using that term. I'm not sure exactly how. I think that was in The Visible and the Invisible, right? I don't know.
I don't remember. Frankly, I can't remember which of the last three books it was in, but that could be. It was one of those words that I just, if you try to look up some of these words, you will get nothing that is meaningful because they're not, they're using them in ways that are sort of idiosyncratic, but they've not become broad enough to where they have a general definition you can find. So I'm just never sure. But
yeah, the way I had to is when we first started using it, I was definitely confused, and I considered looking it up, and I realized like that would probably be a dead end. So I just took it as like a canal is basically, you're cutting something. You're cutting into something to create a path for something. So that's the way. I don't know how else to explain it other than that it's basically, the action of doing that, of a kind of, opening up a space for a kind of determinate direction of flow. And from there, I think you can definitely kind of see exactly where he's going in terms of, why, especially in terms of that he's saying like the simple movement and act of vision then creates like these paths, these paths that lead to like a convergence of different forms. See y'all later. So yeah, that's what I got to say about that. So
with canalization, I was also thinking of, remember the older music technology of cutting grooves in a record, and it's the actual cutting of the groove that is actually transferring the music, and I think for someone like Bergson, when he was writing, canals were just more important. It was much more a part of people's understanding of movement, right? Panama Canal only opened in 1914, Suez Canal 1879, and that would have been much more in people's consciousness. I did want to mention one thing back to Chase's earlier point. In what I've read about people who were blind from birth, who then had surgery to be sighted, even if there was physically nothing wrong with their eyes, if they, for lack of a better term, if they psychologically could not, if they failed to understand what they were looking at, they would literally go blind again, even though there was nothing physically wrong with their eyes. Because, I mean, look at it this way. I mean, we know our shirts are not part of our body. I can take off my glasses, right? Imagine if you couldn't distinguish visually. And it's like, I did that, it'd be like, for other people, it'd be like, he just took out his eyes, or he just peeled off a layer of skin. That would be scary. And when people have tried to describe it, they've said that they literally initially had a hard time distinguishing objects from other objects. The chair from the table, from the floor, from the person. It was more of an impressionistic painting of just a riot of color and movement. And it was their brain just somehow was able to finally say, oh, they could interpret what they were seeing as distinct objects, and then they were all right. But if they couldn't do that, it was back.
Sounds like a good Saturday night.
Just real quick before things end, I just wanted to, I think also the question of like decision and choices and things will have a reference to the larger environment as well, and like other, because all this is about like unities and totalities. It reminds me of so Duquesne, which is the school I'm going to right now, hosted the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy conference this year, and one of the talks that I went to was called "To Do Philosophy the Way Wasps Do Caterpillars," and it was a guy using Bergsonian theory to talk about like there's this wasp that can basically take over the body of this caterpillar and like control it it'll cause it to walk itself back to the wasp's nest. And the only way that this is possible is that like the wasp must have some notion of the internal structure of the caterpillar. Like it must, to be able to in order to like conform its own body to like this internal structure of this other thing. So what this speaker referred to it as was a sympathetic intellection. So there's not only decisions that are being made like are psychological, maybe Bergson used the word psychological, that are being made with reference to like an individual on the one side and the entirety of the environment on the other, but these things are sympathetically related through these sort of like intuitive memory, evolutionary memory, that causes different species to coordinate through long chains of evolutionary development. I think it's interesting.
Very rhizomatic.
Yeah.
What was it? Somebody said something. No. Actually, Brad, I have a quick. Do you know if that lecture, whatever, is that available online anywhere?
No, I looked it up. It was one of the smaller. It was like one of the earlier lectures. It was a bit smaller than the major ones that were more focused on like Hegel and Heidegger.
Oh.
Bergson is still a marginal character.
Yeah. minor literature. Yeah.
Okay. Well, shall we bring it to a close? I think you can get real absinthe now. By the way, I used to not be able to, but I think you can get it now. It was illegal to import it for a while, but
You can attempt to home brew it as well, which I do not recommend.
Is that a
is
suggestion?
this a voice of experience here?
A few bad experiences, correct?
You can
for our next meeting to all get some real absinthe and
you can synthesize. You can isolate mescaline from San Pedro cactus, which is legal. So, the isolating is illegal, but this is all hypothetical, just for
I want to
clarification.
ask, how do you guys know these things exactly?
I don't know. I just
Internet.
listen to weird podcasts, or
Well, an
Some guy named Joe
anthropology
Rogan.
professor taught about ritual magic and
Oh, I took that class. Yeah.
Garber. So,
Yeah.
and Garber had to be very careful to say, do not try this at home, but they did it anyway.
Of course.
I remember him telling you the story about the students that took Datura, which is it's like a deliriant. It's not a psychedelic. So deliriants are like true hallucinogens where, your mom will turn into Saddam Hussein or whatever. And he just like told enough horror stories, I think, to try to like actually get the students to not be interested in this for various reasons, which probably a good idea.
Okay.
You should be experienced like Merleau-Ponty and know some stuff first. Know your stuff before you go haphazardly in this, or you'll probably end up like Schneider. So
Yeah.
our Star Trek took mescaline and saw crabs walking around for years, I think.
Yeah. Chasing him.
really,
Following him everywhere.
wow.
Okay.
Crabs.
Yeah.
Everybody-
God is a lobster.
Yeah.
I'll be safe. I might send you stuff just to torture you guys.
Okay.
Sounds fun.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you later.